So we've been talking a little bit about regression as a tool for doing forecasts. And I wanted to sort of share a couple examples of how that can be done that I think are fairly intuitive and are useful for a beginner. And I think maybe tell an interesting story and show what regression can do. So I'm going to look at two papers by Alan Abramowitz. These are published in PS, Political Science and Politics, which is sort of the general interest political science journal. And before every election, presidential election in the United States, PS puts out a series of different forecasts. And I tend to watch Alan Abramowitz's models for how he tries to predict presidential elections, both because I think they're kind of interesting and because I think that they work really well for my research methods class. So I'm going to run through the models that he presents in two papers for 2012, and then his update that he provided before the 2020 presidential election. And so Abramowitz presents what he calls his time for change model. He says, if you want to understand whether a president is going to win or not, it's a really simple story. It's a story about whether or not that president is popular, which he measures with net approval rating, which is Galup's presidential approval rating in the last poll of June. Second, you want to know, is the economy doing well? If the economy is doing well, people will reward presidents by reelecting them, or reward the incumbent party, I should say, not just presidents, the incumbent party. And so he looks at the second quarter GDP and the change in that. So if it's up by 1%, that's a 1. If it's up by 2%, that's a 2. And then he looks at an incumbency advantage. And so if you're a first-term incumbent, that goes in as well. That gets scored as a 1. If you're not a first-term incumbent, it's a 0. And so he takes these variables and looks at all of the presidential elections since the end of World War II and calculates the incumbent party's share of the two-party vote. So in 1988, Ronald Reagan wasn't running, but George Bush was running as the Republican for the incumbent party. So that would be what we would be trying to measure, George Bush Senior's vote in 1988. And when he crunches those numbers, he gets regression results. And we've talked about sort of how you can take those regression results and build the equation of a line for a forecast. And so our equation for a line is right here. It's the presidential vote share for the incumbent party. That's what we're trying to predict or forecast. I should say it's of the two-party votes. And so if you have a third party running like in 1992, we sort of throw out Ross Perot's vote share and just look at sort of how Clinton versus Bush Senior balanced out. So we have that's our outcome variable. And we have an intercept, that's sort of your baseline where you're starting from, which is 47.3. And for every point of net approval for the president, you're going to have an increase of 0.107. So if the president is 50-50, they get nothing. If they're at 51-49, that would be a 2. Then they get sort of 2 times 1.07. Second quarter GDP, again, if you're growing by 1%, you get half a point, 0.541 increase in your vote share. And if you are an incumbent, you can expect to just have 4.4% greater vote share in the United States. We tend to reelect incumbents unless the economy is doing really bad and they're unpopular, right? And that's essentially what the time for change model is predicting. And Abramowitz says this does pretty well. But he notes that in 1996, it doesn't predict Bill Clinton's vote share as well as it might, and it seems to undercount George Bush's vote share. And Abramowitz starts looking at trends that are happening in the United States, and he suggests that we are entering a partisan era. And so he thinks that we need to adjust our forecasting model to do a slightly better job. And so he adds an additional variable. He adds in this polarization variable. And he says basically after 1992, the fundamentals stop mattering quite as much, right? People stop caring about whether the economy is doing well or not. Or maybe that's not true. Maybe they're viewing the economy through a partisan lens. So if I'm a Republican and a Republican is in office, I will view the economy as great because that's what happens when Republicans are in office. And when a Democrat comes into office, even if the economy hasn't changed at all, I can suddenly view the economy as terrible and start complaining about it because that's what happens when Democrats are in office, right? So we're viewing the fundamentals through a partisan lens, and therefore they don't matter as much in terms of shifting the presidential vote share. And so he says, okay, so I'm going to assume that for most of the World War II era, post-World War II era, fundamentals mattered. But after about 1992, we need to start looking at this polarization thing. And he scores in kind of a weird way. It's one, if you have a first-time incumbent, so you get sort of a double incumbency advantage, or actually maybe it's a disadvantage because the score is negative. If the incumbent is popular, but you are running sort of a non-incumbent, again, that sort of works against you. But if there's no incumbent and the incumbent is unpopular, that's going to be scored as a -1. That's essentially going to give a boost to the party that's out of power, which is not necessarily the most intuitive way to think about it, which is why I don't start with this model. I use the first one to kind of introduce the idea of what's happening, but we can tell basically the same story. That you start off with a baseline of 46.9. That's our intercept from our regression analysis. Net approval is about the same effect. If you have a 50-50 no net approval gain, that doesn't have an effect. If you're 51-49, you have 2 net approval, and so you would expect to get 0.2 or 0.21, I guess, 0.0105 times 2 increase in your vote share for the incumbent party. GDP second quarter, now it's having a huge effect, 0.635. I think that'll increase from like 0.4 before, because we're sort of factoring out the sort of stickiness of later elections. So if the economy is growing by 1%, we should expect that to increase the presidential vote share by 0.635. First-term incumbent, the incumbency advantage actually increased. Now it's 5.22 for incumbents. But then this polarization variable comes in, and if you have an unpopular incumbent who's not running, it's going to get really hard to get reelected. So that really tamps it down for the incumbent party to get reelected to a third term. And so that's this polarization variable. And so he says, if you do this, you'll have a very good chance of predicting who's going to win presidential elections. In fact, he crunches the numbers and calculates his R-square, which is the percent of the variation in your dependent variable that you're able to explain with your model. So he's looking at two-party presidential vote share of the incumbent party. He can explain 96% of that variation in using this model, which is really fantastically good on one hand. On the other hand, he is sort of tinkering, adding variables in to kind of like fine tune it. And so I would hope that he would be able to get a reasonably good model. But all this sort of goes out the window in 2020 because, well, things kind of go out the window in 2020. The pandemic sort of makes the world sort of crazy. So, for one thing, President Trump was an increasingly polarizing figure. So maybe the polarization phenomenon that he was picking up on earlier is sort of supercharged. Secondly, there's a pandemic going on, and that sort of throws all sorts of complications into the world. For one thing, we're not really in the kind of situation that we normally would be in, and so it's hard to know if a model developed under normal times would work under a pandemic situation. And one example of that is that the second quarter GDP, which was sort of so central to his story, right? It's that when the economy is doing well, people re-elect the incumbent. The economy plunged in the second quarter of 2020. It was down 31.4%. That's like there's nothing to compare that to ever in the history of the United States. That's like a cataclysmic value. And of course, the economy recovers in the following quarter, but how do you factor that in, right? It's messy. On top of that, President Trump was historically unpopular. I think Galup had his presidential approval rating at around 38%, with 56 not approving. So that's like 18% negative. But how much of that is President Trump being an unpopular president, and how much of that is the pandemic, and how much of that is just people being distraught in May June of 2020. And so Abramowitz sort of throws everything out the door and says, you know what, we can't even bother with this. We really just need to think much simpler when we're thinking about presidential forecasting. And so he throws out polarization, he throws out GDP, and he says there's an incumbency advantage. We should be comparing apples and oranges. Let's look at incumbent presidents and how they do. And let's look at that in terms of their net approval. And he also does sort of another little tweak in his 2020 version, which is he switches from the two-party vote share of the incumbent party to the electoral votes won by the incumbent party. And I think this is a function of him taking a lot of flack in 2016 when President Trump won the electoral college but lost the popular vote. And Abramowitz sort of knew that that sort of thing was possible. It happened in 2000 as well, but he sort of, sort of hand waved it away and said, oh, well, it doesn't really matter because most of the time the president or the individual, the candidate running who wins the popular vote wins the electoral college. But he shifted over. He's taking enough flack now. He's forecasting electoral college votes. And he says, if you want to predict electoral college votes, what you need to know is the incumbent. Let's look at it, the incumbent, and are they popular or not? And for every net approval point popular, we should expect them to pick up 5.65 additional electoral college votes, starting at a baseline and intercept a constant of 261.8, right? And so a president who's mildly popular, 51 to 49, will have that 2 net approval rating that will get an additional, I guess, 5.65 times 2, it's 11.2, 11.3. That's just what will get you up over the threshold for the 270 or whatever it is you need for to win the electoral college. It's a very simple model. In fact, I would suggest that it's maybe so simple that we don't really even need to know statistics to do it. A lot of people just track presidential approval as a way to know whether or not a incumbent or a candidate is likely to be elected. So I'm not necessarily sure there's a whole lot of value added to this, but it does do very well. It is a statistically significant result. That's the significance, the p-value that's over on the far right-hand side. And it does a fairly good job in terms of explaining the variation in the electoral college vote. He has an R-squared 0.8, so he's explaining 82% of the variation that occurs in the electoral college vote share for the incumbent. And so it's not a bad model. It's just one where I think we've actually kind of gone to the point of simplicity where maybe we don't even need to do the math. Whereas if you're able to tell a more complex story, that there's a couple different things that factor into whether presidents win elections, regression is a really useful tool for being able to sort of parse that out mathematically and say, okay, here is the effect of GDP. Here is the effect of being an incumbent and being able to sort of use that in a very precise way to build our forecasts.